can see the chat.
Okay.
I think we're just a couple minutes. Test. Testing 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. Hello, this is Matt Takahashi, and we'll be starting our webinar in just a few minutes. Hardly hear us. Hold on. Hello, everyone. This is Matt Takahashi, and today I'm hosting Dr. Lon Castle, Chief Medical Officer for Lab and Specialty Drug Services at eviCore Healthcare. He's responsible for the clinical performance of the laboratory medicine and specialty drug programs at eviCore Healthcare. He's been working in the genomic and molecular diagnostic field for over a decade, designing and implementing programs that support personalized medicine initiatives that bring precision medicine to assist with healthcare decisions. Today, he's going to discuss successful payer strategies, including understanding the technology assessment process for tests, learning how evidence evaluations differ for Medicare and commercial payers, and preparing for potential payer presentations. We also received some questions from the audience prior to the broadcast, and Lon's hopes to have the opportunity to answer those inquiries during his presentation. Lon will be talking for about 30 minutes, and then we've budgeted about another 30 minutes for Q&A after his talk. If you have additional questions, please provide them in the chat box on your screen, and he'll do his best to address those as well. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce Dr. Lon Castle.
Thank you, Matt. Get the slides up here. It's my first time, being invited to a public lynching, and it particularly as the guest of honor. It's very special, so I really wanted to thank you for that.
Well,
good morning, good afternoon, everybody. Just wanted to kind of get started on this. So normally when I do a presentation like this, I will generally be sort of asking questions throughout the slides and asking people to kind of just jump in with questions. I think the best thing to do is probably just run through the slides and not get so much kind of discombobulated off topic, so that we have plenty of time at the end for questions. Because I know that's really what you need to do, is you need to get some questions in. I've done my best to integrate some of the questions that I've seen into the presentation, and I'll try and address those as we go. Some of those didn't naturally fall anywhere into the presentation, so as you want to ask them at the end, I'll be happy as you put them in the chat box to kind of go through them at the end. All right. So disclosure is that I'm an employee of Evercore Healthcare, a medical benefits management company that is owned by Cigna. So this sort of leads to the first question. I had a few of them about talking about where I see the future of the program at Evercore going, how the integration with Cigna and Express Scripts and Evercore kind of will sort of change things, where we're thinking of that going. And obviously, those are forward-looking statements, and as the employee of a public company, I cannot answer any of those types of questions. Not unless I want to keep, not unless I don't like my job and I want to go someplace else, because they'll be happy to make sure that that happens if I do. All right, here's the agenda. We're going to talk a little bit about how payers evaluate tests, what is the right type of evidence to develop, then really establishing medical policy coverage expectations within your organization, what you're really likely to get and how you're likely to get it and what you need. Then preparing for some sort of meetings with payers, a couple of do's and don'ts that if you do get to meet with payers, just as an advice. And that's what we'll go through. All right, how do payers evaluate evidence? Now this slide, I'm not going to talk about this slide. You've heard about this the entire time. It's the ACE model is sort of what they use. It looks at analytic validity, clinical validity, and clinical utility. The information behind how this all got started is on the slide. You're welcome to read that, but there's not really much else to say here. We'll go a little bit deeper dive into each of the elements of the ACE model here. Now, the key information for you to know here is clinical utility, because that's what really everybody needs in order to get coverage from payers. And as you know, you generally launch your tests around once you prove clinical validity and you've published that clinical validity trial, giving the sensitivity and specificity and positive and negative predictive values of your tests. And then it's going to take some time to develop the clinical utility, but that's when payers are going to give you coverage, is at the stage of clinical utility. What are the two things they're looking for? Number one, they're looking for change in physician behavior. So that's the first type of study that they like to see. And that generally shows that physicians will take the results of your test and then do something different with the results of the test than they would have done had they not had that test results. Because obviously for a payer, if they're not going to pay any attention to the test results, they're not going to do anything different from the test results, then all you're doing is adding costs to the healthcare system without providing any change to it. And that's not valuable to them. The second part of it is by far the hardest part, is that you have to show that a change in patient outcomes. You have to show that using the tests and the physicians changing their behavior based upon the test results actually improves patient outcomes. So things get better for the patients. We'll talk a little bit about that as we go through. But those are the two key elements you have to remember. All right. So if you're thinking about how we talk about policy decisions, you're thinking about, okay, for the test, is the results accurate? Because if the results aren't accurate, the test is useless. Are the results clinically meaningful? Again, if they're not, the test isn't helpful to anybody. And then are the test results actionable? Can you do something different with them? And the thing is, if the test results aren't actionable, you get to something that's sort of interesting but useless to the payer. If they are actionable, then it's sort of ready for use. So we'll give you an example on the next slide. So if you look here, anybody who sees these two squares of a quilt-like pattern, if you think that they have the exact same color scheme, then you probably have blue-yellow color vision blindness. So there's a difference in the brightness of the colors and the types of colors you can see on the left versus the right. Again, if they're the same for you, you have blue-yellow color blindness, you should probably go to your ophthalmologist. But the thing is, if you decided to create a blindness panel, let's look at all of the different types of hereditary blindness. Let's test for the OPN1LW, OPN1MW, and the OPN1SW gene, just to be able to give people an idea if they have a certain type of color blindness. No one's going to pay for that. You know why? Because the Ishihara books that you see in your ophthalmologist's office, when you go there and they open them and they say, what number do you see in this blob of different colored circles? And what number do you see here? And what shape do you see here? Those are all, that's basically how you can tell color blindness. And those books cost less than 20 bucks. So if you're going to develop a test, a genetic test to develop, to identify color blindness, it's going to have to be all in under $20 for it to be anything useful to the payers, because they already have a way to tell this without the genetic test. So that's sort of an actionable test, but it's kind of useless to the payers. And that's really what we're talking about here: the analytic, clinical, and clinical validity and clinical utility. Okay. Now, a lot of times we get asked over and over again, why do we have to do clinical utility studies? Don't our validity trials that have outcomes in them, those should count? First of all, those trials aren't designed to look at clinical utility. They're designed to look at test performance. And you may capture outcomes based upon test performance, but that's not the same as improving outcomes in a study that's designed to detect whether outcomes are improved or not. And it's also because any payer who's done this for any length of time will tell you that they have seen tests where everything that you think about it when the utility studies come, it doesn't work out like you thought it was going to. And this is the latest example, and it's a good one, and it's fairly recent, is this is a test to test for infectious organisms. So at the same time, it identified what organism was causing the infection you had. It also told you what antibiotics would be useful in treating that organism. So it did it as sort of a single step process. They actually published 8 clinical validity trials. And all of those trials said that, yes, they significantly reduced times to identify organisms and perform antibiotic sensitivity testing when compared to current testing methods. So they said, okay, compare it to what we've got now. Is this significantly faster? And do we get to these, do we identify the organism faster and then tell you what antibiotic you need faster? And consistently, they said they did. So that's great, except for the fact is then they designed and performed a clinical utility trial. Now, that what you would believe, if you would just look at this, you would say, okay, if you can identify the organism faster and you can tell me what antibiotics I need faster, the 2 things I'm surely going to get out of that is, number 1, I'll be able to treat people with infections quicker. So my time to treatment will be less because I won't be so that's the first thing. The second thing is my use of inappropriate antibiotics will be less, because right now, because testing takes longer, I have to start them on an antibiotic, a very broad spectrum antibiotic, and then I can taper it to the right antibiotic later. But I've already had to give them something that if I knew the answer earlier, I wouldn't have to give them at all. So I would save on inappropriate antibiotic use. And of course, the patients get better because I'm giving them the right antibiotic, I'm giving it to them sooner, and so they should get better. And when they actually did the clinical utility trial, they once again proved that they found the organism faster and they got them to the right therapy faster. But the reduction of unnecessary antimicrobial therapy or any change in clinical outcomes for the patient were not clinically significant. So they failed to prove that the test actually improved patient outcomes, even though it did show a high amount of validity. So these are the types of things that payers worry about all the time. They'll see tests, they're sure that I've seen a lot of tests where I'm sure that they're going to work. Sometimes I'm right, sometimes I'm wrong, that they don't pan out when they do the clinical utility trials. So those are the types of things that payers are, looking at. Now, one of the things that I saw was people talk about chain of evidence trials, right? They talk about, well, what's a chain of evidence trial? How does that work? Well, this is exactly sort of a chain of evidence sort of trial, right? You're saying, okay, if I can do this, a chain of evidence, if I can do this, then that follows this, then that follows that. And those studies make sense, just like this study made sense when you laid it out. But they don't always follow through. And that's one of the reasons payers are also a little leery of chain of evidence trials, because we all know that when you start to really think these things through or walk through the steps, you start to see where they can break down. There's nuances in the different steps of the process. There are factors that don't necessarily figure into some of the data that you see. And so each step in the process can represent a potential place for breakdown. And that's where you get to the fact that payers will take chain of evidence trials, but they're leery of them. And oftentimes they won't take a single chain of evidence trial to provide coverage for you. They'll want something else to help support that because they are concerned about whether that actually breaks down in a traditional clinical utility trial. All right. So evidence hierarchy. So this is what an evidence hierarchy looks like. When you get trials, when we get your dossiers and we look at the studies that you provide us, we look at them based upon the types of studies that you send us, right? And as everybody knows, the randomized controlled trials are at the top of the period. Actually, systematic reviews are at the top of the period. I'll talk about that in a second. And then you get controlled clinical trials, uncontrolled, observational studies, case reports, and then expert opinions. And notice that expert opinions and case reports are at the very bottom of the period. They have the least amount of applicability across the population, and they have the highest chance of potential bias. So we'll talk about, so that's sort of how we look at them. So let me talk a little bit more about kind of the meta-analyses. So I have seen a lot of manufacturers start to submit meta-analyses. So we need to talk about what is and what isn't a meta-analysis. So the point of a meta-analysis is to provide some clarity around a clinical question where the results have been conflicting. So the strength in that is that you can combine results from various small studies that may have been underpowered to detect a statistically significant difference in the effect of an intervention. But if you're taking studies that are all powered appropriately, they've all had statistically significant results, then a meta-analysis of these studies isn't helpful because you already know the answers to each of the individual studies. And what I think the labs believe is that if you combine all of these studies together into a meta-analysis, what it does is it increases the N, it makes it a more powerful study, and therefore the study is seen in a better light. And the answer to that is no, it's not, because that's not what a meta-analysis is supposed to do. That's not what a meta-analysis is for. If you already have statistical significant answers out of a study, then putting them in a meta-analysis doesn't change the answers that you already know. So it's not a true meta-analysis, and therefore it's not something that a payer is going to look at and say, okay, yes, I'll change my opinion of the test based upon this meta-analysis. So that's sort of what, so that's, kind of just a background and a little bit of a caveat around doing meta-analyses. Now, the other piece, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this because we just don't have the time, but if anybody's interested, you can start to look at impact factors. So not only do we look at the types of studies that you do, but journals have a thing called journal impact factors. And they measure essentially how much an article is read and how much it is referenced in other articles. And so the higher the impact factor, the more important the journal is, the more widely read it is, the more sort of, that's where people go to get their kind of education and their standard of care, where the standards of care come from. And so if you're looking at the journals, like the really ones with really high impact factors are like the New England Journal of Medicine has like an impact factor of like 20. And Lancet has like 15. Lancet Oncology is around 16. Journal of American College of Cardiology is like 12. JAMA is like around 9. But a lot of what we'll see is a lot of publications are in these impact factors with really low single-digit numbers. Some of them are less than 1, have impact factors of less than 1. Those are the types of journals you can get published in pretty quickly. And so we look at those things, around studies to say, okay, was this really a study that was really well done and is in a high-tier journal, or is this just something that they got it out quickly, it got into a journal with a very low impact factor, we're not even sure about how good the peer review is in this type of journal, so we're a little more skeptical of the evidence in there, we want to read that evidence a little more closely. So just to get some background about how we look at it, not only do we use kind of the types of studies you've done, but actually where those studies are published to give us some determination of kind of the quality of the studies that are out there. All right. So just trying to kind of answer a couple questions here before we move along and that relate to this. And one of them was, where do payers find eviCore provides the most value? And I think I ask myself that every day. I always say to myself, why are these people hiring us? What is wrong with these people? But something is wrong with them and they keep hiring us. So it would seem that just from all the questions that we get, that helping them make decisions on new tests, like whether to cover them, whether to not cover them, what they do, why they're out there, that would seem to be kind of what they like of us most. But I would say that the real reason is our expertise in the genomic space. And the problem is that most payers don't have the time to really spend in the genomic space to really fully understand it or keep up with it, nor do they usually have the, kind of a medical geneticist or a molecular pathologist on board like we do that really look at this day in and day out. Listen, I do genetics every single day, right? I do the molecular and genetic stuff every day, single day. I look at new tests, I read the literature, and I find it hard to keep up. If that's not what you're doing every day, it's really, really hard to keep up. And so I think that's one of the real reasons they pick us, because it's just hard for them to do it. And it's interesting, you can see that in the attitude from the medical directors. It's pretty illuminating. So initially when they hear we're coming in, they're very much against us. They think we're going to take their jobs and we're going to take this stuff away from them. And that, now that they're not doing these genetic cases anymore, that the company doesn't need as many of them. So people are going to lose their jobs. Really quickly, what they realize is the same thing that the companies know. There's more than enough work to do. And what the companies are really doing is repurposing them for other activities where they can actually be much more productive. So for example, if you look at us, if we do a straightforward case review, it could take us about 15 minutes to do that review. for most payers, if you're not a geneticist or you don't see these cases all the time, it can take them an hour or more to do a single case. That means you only get a couple of these types of cases in a day. Now, if you have somebody like us do these cases, we can get through much more cases in a day, number one. And number two, that hour that person in the health plan was spending doing this single case, that hour can be put to a multitude of other tasks that they can be doing. They can be doing a whole lot of other cases. Remember, they're not just doing genetic cases, right? They've got cases around drugs, got cases for radiology and cardiology and devices and everything else that we don't do. And so they're the ones, so for them, they get to spend their time doing these other things. They're not as stressed because the case volumes aren't building up on them as much. They're getting through cases faster and they're happier and they seem to do better. And again, they were always a little uncomfortable with the genetic stuff anyways, because it's not something they did all the time. So I think if you talk to the payers, one of the things that I think it helps them mostly with is that they're repurposing their workforce in a way that's more beneficial to the workforce and more beneficial to them. All right. So let's talk about the clinical utility studies. Now, everybody talks about, the randomized controlled trials, and everybody needs to have randomized controlled trials. In the lab space, that's just not something that can be done. I mean, I appreciate, that in other disciplines that you can do these, especially in pharma, they do these all the time, and they do big, huge randomized controlled trials. You don't have the money that they have in pharma to do these trials. These trials are expensive. They take a lot of time. It's really hard to do them. Now, if you can do something where the outcomes can be attained quickly, then there's no reason you can't do a randomized controlled trial. But that's not how most genetic tests work. So you really have something that has a much longer outcome space. So then you have to think about different types of styles, and payers should be receptive to different types of studies, right? Prospective, retrospective studies. When you start to take a bunch of data that's already been done, this data has been done for several years. And so then you look at it in a prospective manner. You already have the outcomes there. You could take something that was, a test, an intervention that was done 5 years ago and look at those types of things. You can do registry trials. And registry trials have been, very popular. And registry trials are good because they sort of show a real world approach to the evidence. Now, the only trouble is that a lot of the registry studies have sort of a significant sort of a bias inherent in them, because these registry trials a lot of times start with the clinicians who first started using the test, who got a lot of training on the test. So those training set of clinicians who really first started with it have a lot of familiarity with it. And then you get another set of physicians who are involved in your validation trials, right? And so what happens is that after that, you're getting the clinicians who are naive to the test and they don't know. So you're getting sort of a blend of people who know what to do and then people who don't really know what to do. What the payers are interested in is the physicians that don't know what to do, who are completely new to this test. How do they behave? Their behavior is going to tell them how the rest of the country is going to behave, not this small set of physicians. So those are the types of things that you need to look at when you're kind of creating registry studies. And we've seen this in sort of these physician behavior studies that I talked about earlier as the first part of clinical utility studies, right? So initially when Genomic Health did the first change in physician behavior study, and their change in physician behavior was somewhere around 38%, I believe. Now you'll see these change in physician behavior studies, they're like 70%. 65, 70%. Well, why so much better? Are they just better at understanding it? No, it's because these change in physician behavior studies are being biased by physicians who have been taught how to use the test, who've been using it for years, and then are included in these studies. That affects the results. They're biased in that way. So that's sort of what you've seen in the change in those studies over time, just sort of points out the inherent biases and sort of creep into those types of studies. All right. Okay, let's talk about the evidence assessments when you do your evidence assessments. Really talking about the types of things that people do when they look at the evidence. So one of the things that you do is you look at the external sources of data, right? So companies can use guidelines or pathway organizations, and almost everybody does this, right? They use NCCN, they use the American College of Cardiology, whatever they use. They can use technology assessment committees, right? So they can look at Hayes or Evidence Street or ECRI. So now eviCore does its own technology assessments, and I can talk to you about that throughout this. So we don't use Hayes or Evidence Street or ECRI or anybody like that. You obviously always look at government agencies, what you're being required to do by the FDA, by CMS, by any of the MACs. You can look at, obviously, the guidelines in the professional societies. And then some payers actually look at individually contracted providers and industry experts. They will actually reach out to them to talk about the tests. And then a lot of payers look at others' medical policy, but not for the reason that you think. And we will often look at others' medical policies as well when we're doing a technology assessment. Primarily, that's not to see how they think it should be paid for or how we think it should be paid for, because we're coming to our own conclusions about that. I don't really care about how they've kind of come to their conclusion based upon the evidence, because, and I could talk about this in a little bit, how they come to the conclusion and the conclusions that they come to differ from plan to plan for a very specific set of reasons. So what I'm mostly interested in is, did I miss anything big? Did they, in their kind of assessment of the literature, did they find a study that I didn't find? So those are the types of things when I look at policies I'm interested to find, but I'm not really looking at what their decision was, because that doesn't really matter very much to me. So now, as we talk about these, developing policies and what we look at and everything, there was a question about, kind of mechanism for an ad hoc review and how do we see those types of things. So I will tell you that, getting an ad hoc review is sort of like winning the lottery. They're incredibly rare. I mean, people think that you can do these ad hoc reviews all the time. You just can't. What you really need for an ad hoc review is some sort of groundbreaking study. Again, something that needs to be published in the New England Journal of Medicine. If you've published a new clinical utility study or a new economic analysis, we will slot that to be reviewed at the standard time that we reviewed the policy, but we're not going to stop and change policy or do anything based upon one of those studies. You need to do something that changes the guideline, that does something significant before we will even consider sort of an ad hoc review of something. So, for example, the last time we did sort of an ad hoc review and changed a policy was in 2017, the very beginning of 2017. And that's when spinal muscular atrophy testing was recommended to be included as part of expanded carrier screening. And that was because Spinraza came out at the end of December of 2016. So now it made sense to do SMA testing, because you could actually treat the patient if you found that they had SMA early on. Before that, it didn't matter when you found it, after they were born or when they were in utero, because there was no treatment for it. There wasn't anything you could do. So that's the kind of groundbreaking thing I'm talking about that lets us change kind of our policies. Some of the other things that I've been asked about are kind of the variation I just mentioned, that the variation between the commercial payers. Now, there is some variation, and that's usually based on a couple of things. Number one is, are they willing to take a test before clinical utility is established? Some of that comes from the plan's philosophy, right? Every health plan sort of has their own philosophy. Some of them are early adopters. Some of them are just sort of fast followers, and they want somebody else to be first. They never want to be first. And then other ones are sort of those kind of laggards at the end. They don't want to be last, but they don't want to be first or even in the middle. So depending upon their philosophy, it sort of tells you where they are in adopting the evidence. And that has nothing to do with anything other than how they view coverage of tests. The other thing that has to do with that is depending on who's in their network, right? So we have clients, and I'm sure other payers have clients as well, where you have a test that someone in their physician network developed. Well, even though we would have an investigational and experimental grade on that test because it didn't have the necessary evidence, the plan wants to pay for that test because that physician is in their network. And so we will, create a special policy to help pay for that test. That's a reasonable thing for them to do. I completely understand it. But that's, again, they're going to look different. They're going to have a policy on something that's different than somebody else. And then, but the real variation in how these plans isn't really what the policies they have. It's how they attack those policies or how they decide to manage those policies, right? Whether they do it through prior authorization, whether I do it through claims management, network contracting. That's the real difference. So you have subtle differences in policy, perhaps, as to whether they cover it or don't cover it, but you have a lot more variation in how they execute on that coverage strategy. And as far as, us looking at guidelines, again, I mentioned in the slide about the guidelines, as far as us looking at guidelines, one of the things that we do is we have, so there was an article published recently in the Journal of Bone and Joint Surgery. And so I was a sports medicine doctor in my previous life, which is why I still look at things like the Journal of Bone and Joint Surgery. And they published something called It's the Evidence, Not the Guidelines. And that's really the fundamental thing. We look at guidelines. We look at guidelines that are outside the US. If there are no US guidelines, we'll put those in our policies. But it's all about whether their conclusions can be supported by the evidence. It's the evidence that drives everything that we do, which is why we don't always agree with some of the guidelines, such as, like, for NCCN. Now, NCCN is a consensus organization. It is not an evidence-based organization. And you can see that in the vastly different ways the individual panels interpret the evidence. Some of them are much more sort of ahead of the evidence. The prostate panel is certainly there. The breast cancer is certainly getting there. Others are, with the evidence, and still others are a little behind the evidence. So it all depends on the evidence for us. And we want to make sure that the guidelines interpretation of the evidence and our interpretation of the evidence match. If they don't match, that's an issue, and we have to sort of figure out why and how we want to manage that. But it's really all about the evidence. Had some questions about how we create and monitor clinical policies. I'll go through that quickly because I know that's going to come up anyways. I will leave out the, how we create policies in the first place, how we create them, how we prioritize which ones we're going to write first. That's a longer discussion. So for brevity, I'll just talk about what we do. So we have a team that surveys the literature and monitors any new publications. And as we keep those in a spreadsheet, and those are, for the test. And then when the test comes up for review, we have everything in one place. When it's time to update the policy, we look at the dossier that you send, which was great. It's always helpful to have the dossiers. But then we do our own research just to make sure there weren't any published studies after we got the dossier, or there aren't studies published from other countries or in other ways with the test that we want to include in our research. And then we'll do an analysis. We'll have an analyst who kind of says, okay, what are the key questions I need to have answered for this test? What are we really looking for? And then they'll evaluate the evidence and they'll grade each study. They'll give a grade to each study. And then if the studies support the indication of the test and we've answered all the key questions, then we start to write our technology assessment as to, okay, yes, here's the studies, here's what we thought about the studies, here's how they are, here's how they support these key questions, and then we'll come to a conclusion as to whether we will or we won't cover that. Once that's done, the policy team looks at the technology assessment to determine if they agree or they disagree, or then that they need to make some changes to our current policy, and if so, what changes need to be made. Then the policy team, they won't bring everything to kind of the physicians, me or the physicians that are on our larger panel, but they'll bring tests where they have questions, or they may have, or we are going to make major changes, and they want to make sure that those major changes are appropriate. Now, these are all internal physicians then that will be looked at. They're physicians like me inside the program, but they're also physicians outside the program in other programs like in medical oncology and radiology and musculoskeletal medicine, if those tests happen to impact those areas. We also have access to physicians outside of our company and a medical advisory board, and they have a wide variety of specialties. In particular, they're very. We have a lot of them that are very good at giving us advice on methodological designs, statistical methods that may have been used in the studies, epidemiologic questions. Some of them are experts in certain areas, which we find necessary because they're complicated tests. So we can also reach out to them and ask them. Now, once that's completed, the policy is entered into our content management system and then goes to our internal medical advisory committee to review and approve. Once that's done, then the policies go out to the individual clients for review. And clients usually have 30 to 60 days, depending upon the contract, to review these. We also set up a meeting with the clients' clinical teams to review the changes with them and then field any of their questions and answer those questions. And then once they approve the changes in the policy, the new policies, then they're posted on the client's website for the mandated number of days, per the state's requirement. And then we start the process all over again. So that's sort of a big, clunky process to be able to get this right. It goes through a lot of layers to ensure that we've thought through things. So I just wanted to give you a flavor as to what that was, because I figured at some point in time you'd like to get some background on that. All right. Let's move. Next is meetings with us. Okay, so let's talk about meetings with payers. So what you get from one payer, like once you talk to one payer, you've talked to one payer, because everybody's going to be a little different. When you're talking to Medicare, what I would advise, and I'm sure Gabe Van Wilner said the same thing to you, they want early interactions, right? They want to talk to you as soon as possible. They want to talk their staff to talk to you about recommendations, what studies they'd like to see, what kind of evidence they're looking for. So they're very sort of collaborative in the way they do things, particularly if you're going to end up going through the parallel review process if you're tied to a drug in some way. The LBMs and commercial payers just are not designed to provide this sort of study design and support. And so generally for us, you want to come after, either after your clinical validity trial has been published or right before your clinical utility studies are going to be published. That's probably the ideal time for you. And I know sometimes if a test is complicated, you might want to get in a little earlier, but that's kind of the sweet spot for us because we're really just looking at the evidence, and then we can talk to you about the formal presentations that we want to see, but we're really not into talking to you about all of the study designs. And so just as a thought behind this, when you're talking about looking at our policies and you think that there's something that's dated, not in alignment with the evidence that you've published or the things that you've put out, one of the things, it's quite reasonable to just ask them, do you have, if you don't see a key study in there, was that study assessed? We're seeing that this is missing from it. So, and please, kind of just sort of ask us respectfully about those things. I can't tell you over the last couple of years that sort of the tone has gotten much more demanding and not questioning about these things. It's like, we're being told that, you have to change this. You haven't done this. You have to change this. I know for us particularly, if you look at our policies are written for the physician. So they're short, they have very short reference section, and they're not the kind of the Blue Cross Blue Shield Association evidence street policies. Those things are long, they're very thorough, they have all of the stuff included. We do all that stuff in our technology assessment. So we have a technology assessment behind the scenes that has all that information in it. So even though you don't see that study in the policy, it doesn't mean we haven't looked at that study. 99 times out of 100, we've looked at that study. We have it in our technology assessment. It just didn't change what we had already decided about the test. It didn't impact it in one way or the other that it was significant enough for us to reference it. We only reference things that sort of are significant or have changed our opinion on something or made a change in some sort of a policy. We don't reference everything. Again, for us, it's a desire to try and make these things quickly readable by physicians if they want to figure out how they're supposed to get a test covered. So that's sort of, kind of the difference between how different people sort of use the policies and what they include in them. All right, so now let's talk a little bit about preparing for a payer presentation. The first rule of thumb, and this should go back right to your board or to your C-suite. Do not expect to get a policy because you have one from MolDX or an LCD from some other MAC, okay? Medicare looks at different things. They look at tests for the Medicare population, not for commercial members. And they also allow for coverage while monitoring evidence development. If you look at a lot of their draft LCDs, and we read those draft LCDs, you'll see a lot of them point to the fact that they don't believe that there's clinical utility for the test yet, but that the test is promising enough that they're willing to cover it and as that evidence continues to accumulate. And then, in theory, they will, as they have in the past. If that evidence doesn't get demonstrated, if they don't get final clinical utility, they will remove that test from coverage. So they have a different perspective than commercial payers do. You have to know the stage of evidence development for your test. Why? Because first of all, if somebody's asking you, are we going to get coverage from this payer? If you have published clinical utility trials, the chances of you getting coverage are a whole lot better than if you just have clinical validity trials, right? You're not going to get covered with validity trials. You might with utility trials, depending upon the trial. So it helps set the right expectation. And again, you need to alter your approach. If you're coming to me with clinical utility, you're really trying to say, listen, we believe this test is ready. Here's what we've demonstrated. Here's the outcomes that we've shown have changed. And so we're having a conversation about the test in a different way than if it's a validity trial, right? You're not getting coverage. What you're really looking to do, hopefully, if you're coming to me with a validity trial, is really to educate me about the test, right? To tell me, okay, this is a test that's different than what you've seen before. So we want to get in front of you and talk to you about the type of test this is, how this works, because it's sort of different than what you're used to. And so we want to make sure that you understand what those differences are. So it's a different perspective when you're talking to me about those types of tests. Let's see what else. And then if you can talk to the policy teams, that's always helpful. They can be a valuable resource. And then Again, we're not staffed or really designed to tell you what types of studies you should be doing. And again, if I tell you what type of study I think you do to do coverage, that works for me at eviCore, but that's it. But maybe Cigna would want you to do something else. Maybe United would want you to do something else. I don't know, which is why we don't really talk to the manufacturers about what tests we think should be studied. Try and get to a couple more questions here. So if we're talking about why doesn't eviCore kind of share timelines for annual reviews? And we do that very purposefully, and that's mostly through a lot of personal experience. So I did work on the lab side. I did work in managed care on the lab side. And, so what happens is what we would do is follow sort of when the reviews said they were going to be due and those, kind of update dates were posted, we would tell the leadership when the reviews were due. Leadership would then share that with the C-suite or the board and say, okay, well, these payers are going to review this, so we'll know if we have coverage here or there. Any of this sound familiar to you? Certainly is the way that it was for me. And then, but review dates are when the policies are reviewed. That's not necessarily when the policies are published or when you can see them. So policies only have to be reviewed once a year. When they get published is up to the determination of the process that they have to publish it, whether or not there's a lot of questions about the test. Sometimes those things can be delayed months where they go through a different analysis on it. So when those things would happen, I know what we would do is we would immediately call those plans, or write those plans, and start asking, why is it delayed? When is it coming out? What kind of trouble is there with it? And we would just do a flurry of phone calls and everything because we were getting then pressure from our management, who was getting pressure from the C-suite or the board as to why when we told them it was going to come out at this time, it didn't come out at this time. And I can tell you on my side, we just are not staffed to kind of handle that sort of questions. We get them anyways, even without, kind of leading as to when things are likely to be published. We still get calls, dozens and dozens of calls every time just before the policies come out. When is this going to be changed? When is this going to be updated? It's just a huge, kind of a time sink for our folks. And it's one we're just not really staffed to handle, because we would literally get hundreds of inquiries every year on this topic if we didn't publish a review on time, or if it wasn't published when it said it was going to be published, even though we had reviewed the test on time. So that's sort of why you see differences in, that's why why eviCore is, we've just decided, we just don't have the time to go through that. So I know for you, it's really, really challenging, and I apologize, but really that's really all we can do with the staff that we've got, just to handle all of the information that we need to, without sort of all of the external distractions. All right. Now, when you get to these meetings, a couple of do's and don'ts for you, right? So obviously, if you have new scientific publications or guidelines, go ahead and forward those to us, right? Those are a good opportunity to start a dialogue. Don't send us an email every time you release new information, okay? We'll just put it in a file so you can kind of package those things. Always ask for an opportunity to present. Now, I know, unfortunately, we were very good about letting labs present to us very early on in the process. But again, we've had to change that because we just don't have the bandwidth. Literally, we could have labs presenting for 8 hours a day, every day, every 5 days of a week throughout the entire year, because we have that many requests for people to talk to us. We don't have that kind of time to talk to folks. So in general, we'll reach out to the labs, or sometimes the labs reach out to us and we will say, yes, we will do this because there's something interesting about your data, or there's one of the studies that we're not quite sure if we're reading it this way, but we're not quite sure that that's right. And we do reach out often to labs and say, hey, would you present this? Would you present to us? Because we've got a question about something that you've got. But unfortunately, you just don't have the access to us that you used to have. There's just too many labs out there, and we just don't have the sort of the bandwidth for that. So I apologize for that in advance, but unfortunately, that's sort of the way things have evolved. As far as local physicians, again, remember we're on that pyramid of evidence, kind of expert opinions and case reviews are. They don't carry a lot of weight. So it doesn't really do you much good to have them write us letters or talk to us about your test. It's just a low level of evidence that we're not going to pay a lot of attention to. It's not going to move the needle. Again, whenever you're at meetings like this one with me, have a chance to meet me, talk to me. I'm a reasonably grumpy person, and I just don't like people in general, which is, of course, why I'm on the payer side. But I'll always talk to you. I may not be able to help you, but I'm always willing to talk to people about this. I mean, I'd like for you to understand how to do things. I'd like to work together and try and get these things done. But you're busy, we're busy, and it's just usually very challenging. And the last thing I'll say is don't use connections to reach out to, my CMO, our CEO, or a board member about why your test isn't being covered. That's not going to help you get coverage because I don't make any decisions based upon that. But what it does do is it wraps my team up for a couple of weeks because now we have to present. Now, the CMO isn't so difficult because, they're a clinician and I can explain to them what the utility data is and why things aren't there. And so they'll understand fairly quickly. CEO or board member is an entire new story. I got to create new slides for that. I've got to explain to them what the test does, why it does it, what's important about it. I've got to give them a lot of background. Then I've got to start to talk to them about evidence and the data in a way that's, that in a way that's got to be kind of brought to the level that they will understand it. That takes a lot of time and effort. So when you do those sorts of things, you make my life more miserable. And if you make my life more miserable, the inclination for me to help you pretty much goes out the door. I'll be professional with you at all times, always. I will never alter my review on your test based upon, whether or not you've pissed me off in the past, because that's not how medicine works, right? This is about the evidence. It's not about whether I like you or I don't like you. If I don't like you and you have the evidence, you still get policy. If I like you and you don't have the evidence, you don't get policy. That's how that works. I don't bring personal things into it. It's not the way this goes. But you'll certainly get the very least of what I can do if you do something like that and make my life miserable. So anyways, I think, Matt, that's probably the end of this. This is just a checklist for you to go through when you're talking about it. Again, remember, when you come and see us, this is not a sales presentation, right? I don't need the sales pitch. I know the background information about this. Most of the folks there do. So you can tell us a little bit about physician uptake. You can tell us a little bit about the background of the disease state, but I already know most of this. If I've done my job right, and my team has done their job right, when they're on the call with you, we've already kind of looked at the background, looked at the disease state itself. So we've educated ourselves on that. If you've got 60 minutes, don't spend 30 of it telling us that stuff. Spend spend the majority of the time talking about your studies, walking us through them, talking about why they're important and what there are. Again, this is not grand rounds. So you're not trying to persuade me to use the test. The evidence is going to persuade me. Focus on the evidence. Ask if they want to hear about ongoing studies. So the stuff that you've got in trials works as a double-edged sword. So be wary of this. So we only consider published data. I like to hear about the abstracts that you've got out there and those types of things, because what it lets me know is what you're thinking about the test, how your studies are being prepared, and what I can start to see in the future. So it gives me sort of a roadmap as to what I'm looking to get in the future and what types of things I can expect to be published soon, and so that I can look for them. Other people might use that and say, oh, you're still doing studies on this? Well, you're clearly investigational experimental because you're still doing studies. So I will tell you, be really careful with that stuff. I like them. Nobody's going to consider those things for published policy because they only take peer-reviewed published evidence. But again, some will like to hear it because they like a roadmap. Others of them will use it against you. So that's sort of caveat emptor for you. And then just make sure that you look at our policies on the test, and you, again, ask about our interpretations of the study and the data. I remember, when I was on the other side, I figured out, through kind of some of these questions that one of the payers was interpreting one of our results wrong. And it wasn't actually their fault. When I went back and read the study, I realized that the way it was written, you could interpret it both ways, the way we meant for it to be interpreted and the way the payer actually interpreted it. And so that was really helpful to have that sort of discussion with them. So anyways, it's always helpful to kind of look at those things just to make sure that you have relayed the information that you want. So again, summary for you is just about, the payers follow evidence evaluation processes. Clinical utility is the major thing you want to do. The type and the quality of the publications you put out does matter to us. You do need a publication strategy. So just like you need a marketing strategy, you need a publication strategy for your test. You need to know when these studies are going to be done, when they're going to be be published, because that's going to tell you how you need to go out to the payers and when to go out to the payers. And then prepare for your discussions with payers, just like you prepare for any meeting that you go into. And that's about it. Matt, is there anything else you need from me? I can sit down and start to go through the chat.
I think if we go and address the chat, that might be a good next step. And I think if you scroll down to the bottom, Mindy Cheng has a question, and we can maybe work from there upwards, if that's okay with you.
Okay, that one. Okay, great. So, Mindy, clinical utility study design. If it is a novel diagnostic, can clinical decisions be made based off the novel diagnostic in an interventional clinical utility study? So, so one of the things about sort of interventional studies, make sure you have, and also make sure you have comparator groups, and make sure you have historical comparator groups. Just remember that kind of clinical care changes over time and guidelines change over time. So one of the things you want to make sure that you do is be sure that that when you change, that when you have shown that your test is making a change in something or improves outcomes in something, make sure that there hasn't been some sort of guideline change or practice change in there that may have contributed to that improvement in care. So one of the things is you always want to make sure that you have some sort of historical cohort that is sort of matched, that you can compare with to kind of root out that sort of bias. And then what are the best tactics to engage payers to perform critical reviews on technology? Many policies contain errors and do not include all publicly available publications. Okay, so I talked a little bit about that right now. Make sure that their policies do include, all publications that they are reviewed. I know our outward-facing policies do not. Our in-facing technology assessments do. So just to ask them, mostly whether they have looked at those studies or whether they have seen that study, or whether that is that the policy lists all of the studies that they looked at. So because I don't know whether other payers do what we do. And then again, payers have a timeline for these types of things. Just make sure you get us the dossiers, the evidence that you want us to use, and we will get to it, because it's what we do. So we will look at it. And again, we're not, this is sad to say, but we don't make our living, kind of by telling people no. It doesn't make a difference. To us, it's all about the evidence. If a test deserves to be covered, we'll provide coverage for it. And people tend to think that the payers, just want to say no. The sad part in genetics and lab is that there's so much misuse and so much abuse that goes on that we're always going to be able to save the payers money in what we do. There's always something to save them money on. So just for example, when we went 4 years ago, we started covering NIPT for average risk women, not high risk women, because you could see that's where the evidence was going. And it was pretty clear that the evidence said that that's what should be done. ACOG just finally changed their guidelines just a couple weeks ago here. But anyway, so when we went to that was a huge chunk of our savings for clients. And the clients were like, well, you can't do this because you're going to, this is going to be a loss for us. And now you're not going to save us as much money. And we're worried about that. And we told them the same thing that we're telling you. Don't worry about it. Trust us. Next year, when we come to show you the savings that we've created for the program, you're going to see we've probably saved just as much, if not more, even paying for this, which you should pay for, by the way, because it's the right thing to do. And sure enough, the next year we went in there, we had an even higher ROI than what we had the year before, even after getting them to pay for that. So pretty quickly, they understand as well that it's important to pay for the tests that need to be done, and that there's always going to be money to be saved, because there's always billing errors. There's always sorts of tests that shouldn't be being paid for and are being over marketed, or being wellness things are being done. So it's a lot. There's a lot to be saved. You don't need to worry about trying to save money just by saying no. It's the wrong way to approach things. Does Cigna use eviCore for genetic test policies? They do not. Cigna actually has a contract with Informed DNA to do their genetic testing policies. Does Cigna and Evercore's screening policies mirror each other? Meaning if Cigna has a less restrictive policy, does Evercore adhere to their policy? No. So we have completely different policies than Cigna. And even, if Evercore does begin to do Cigna's policies at some point in the future, to us, Cigna will be, a health plan, just like any other health plan that we manage. And Cigna will have their own policies that we will manage for them, and they will be different than policies that we manage for other health plans. So we put together things that are standards of policies that we believe that we believe should and shouldn't be covered. Plans have the ability to, kind of modify those somewhat based upon their local market and things that are going on there, or things that they want to do or they believe will work. And we'll work with them on those things. So, just because, we're now owned by Cigna doesn't mean that we're going to adopt Cigna's policies, or that the policies we develop for Cigna will be the same policies that we create for all of our other clients. Each client has their own individual needs and philosophy that we have to sort of follow when we're creating these things. I'm sorry, I must have missed somebody here. Proteomic tests that will be focused mostly on Medicaid and commercial payer coverage. So yes, we do have experience with proteomic tests. As a matter of fact, that's one of the things that we see as clearly. I think the person who asked the question asks that's going to be something that's going to be a much bigger part of kind of testing in the future. In the next couple of years, the proteomic tests and these kind of multi-analyte tests that are non-genomic are going to explode. And there's going to be a lot of information, a lot of questions from clients about those. So yes, we have hired some folks who specifically understand that space, know about those types of tests, so that we'll be ready as those things come out. Can you explain how you look at health economics, or just focus on the clinical evidence not having impact? Okay, so I am the worst person to ask about health economics in the world, because this is to me, it's sort of like a weather analogy, right? So you do a budget impact model or a clinical effectiveness study, or use all these Markov models. These are all these things that are predicting kind of how much money you'll save with these tests, right? So this is just like the weather, right? The weatherman tells me all the time it's not going to rain, it's going to be beautiful today, but I bring an umbrella every single day. So I understand that as you're trying to predict these things, that you're doing your best to do it. However, I will tell you, I've been looking at budget impact models and comparative effectiveness studies for, let's see, what's it been now? It's been about 13 years. And I have never, ever seen one that says the test won't save me lots of money. So when I see studies over and over and over again that tell me every test that's coming to the market is going to save money, but somehow when they get on the market, not all of them save money, I start to wonder about, kind of the accuracy of some of these models. So you take that sort of into consideration. But again, I've never seen a study that doesn't say the test is going to save money. So I don't put a huge amount of stock into those types of models. Let's see. For clinical validity, clinical utility, and economic utility. Yes, I did not hear talk about economic utility. Again, so let me talk about economic utilities where it comes to other payers. I told you sort of my bias about economic utility. So a lot of plans do use sort of the economics to make a decision about a test. So they will say, all right, so let's talk about something like the new tests. There's going to be new tests. There's going to be new molecular tests for urinary tract infections, and those are going to be coming out, and they're going to be more accurate. They've in being able to find the bacteria. They've got some issues, as to knowing what really causes the infection. So there's some things that need to be worked out in the technology, but that's going to come. The question, this is where, the economic utility is going to come in. How are you going to price that test when you can right now do like a urine culture and sensitivity for, maybe $3 or $4? Anything more than that, and the payers are going to go, okay, yeah, great, this might be better, but how are you going to justify a price when I pay like $3 or $4 for something right now? So they sort of use it when it kind of impacts how their current payment structure works for different tests. So that's that. And again, you can't. I mean, again, all these cost saving analyses, the payers are leery of them as well, because again, everything always shows that things save money. I mean, and I've done a lot of Markov models. I've done some budget impact models. I can show you how to kind of wrangle some of the variables in those models to make things look better, to make things look worse. So a lot of the time when I look at these models, what I'm looking at is how did you set up the variables? What assumptions did you make? Because I know by asking those sorts of questions where you get the savings in the models. And then I know whether there's some reality to it or not. So again, budget impact models are important. They're really important, because a lot of times the clinical teams and the contracting teams aren't really on the same, they don't talk to each other a lot. And so when a clinical team says, hey, we want to pay for this test, what they want to know is, okay, is this test likely to save me money? Is there some value to this test financially? Because I'm going to have to go to the contracting department and tell them, well, you need to contract for this. And then the contracting department comes back and says, they want $30,000 for this test. Are you insane? We're not paying that kind of money. Why did you say we would approve this test? So what they want to do is they want to know that they're on solid financial ground before they go talk to their contracting partners. So that's one of the reasons that they want to know the kind of the economic utility of a test. But again, mostly the test that your whether or not you get approved for test is going to be determined on your clinical utility evidence, not on your economic utility. Let's see. Are there any commercial plans that are doing coverage with evidence developments? Okay, so there are probably some commercial plans that do coverage with evidence developments. Generally, what they do is kind of pilot programs with you, right? So they will pilot a program with your test on a certain number of patients, and then they'll kind of do a data analysis of that just to see. So those types of pilot programs do happen within tests. They're not very common within the payers, but they do happen. That's sort of it. Other payers will do sort of value-based models of paying for your test, where they'll want certain parameters around that. And so there was another question about value-based models and what payers were likely to do them. So I can't tell you specifically what payers do. That's certainly it, but I can tell you what sort of payers to look for, right? So again, new payers. So if you've got a payer that's new to the marketplace, they're probably going to be interested to break into the marketplace by doing something novel. So they would be somebody who would be potentially interested in doing a coverage with evidence development or some sort of value-based care arrangement. Same thing for like tests that have innovative benefit design. So if you see a health plan that's touts its innovative benefit designs, or they have some interesting benefit designs around how they pay for things and what types of things they pay for, they might be a good candidate to reach out to see if they're interested in doing a value-based arrangement, because they're looking to do different and new things. Small plans, regional plans, those are plans that are more likely to do a value-based agreement than a large national plan. And then the other ones look for plans that are physician-owned. There are physician-owned health plans out there. They tend to be more likely to do value-based care agreements. So those are the types of people that you should be looking for if you're going to look at that. Let's see. Any synergistic collaborations with other eviCore programs like diagnostic imaging? So we have a program that's called OnConnect, which is basically a integration with our genetic testing, medical oncology, radiation therapy, and the advanced imaging portion of radiology. So rad therapy, medonc, genetics, and advanced imaging. They're all sort of tied together and are able to kind of work together to make sure that the right tests are done before chemotherapy is ordered, to make sure that there wasn't a targeted therapy that would have been a better match for the person, make sure they've done the tests, make sure that if you're going to do chemotherapy, that you do something like Oncotype or Mammoprint or something that can tell you whether chemotherapy is even going to be effective for breast cancer patients. So we do have some synergistic arrangements, with the policy, with the programs, and there are other programs that we just respond to requests for, because we'll get a lot of requests from radiology about, hey, this person says that they have this mutation and therefore they want a breast MRI and not a CT, not a mammogram. Is that appropriate? And so there's a lot of questions from all the other programs that ask about certain genetic tests and then whether tests in their area are appropriate based upon those genetic test results. Let's see, proteomic-based LDTs. Look at the pathways pursued by genomic LDTs, or is it an evolving field and will take a different pathway? Yes, I would say if you're looking at a proteomic-based test now, so you're not strictly speaking a genetic test, but you're still a lab test, and the lab tests generally follow the same sorts of pathways for approval that devices do. So lab tests and devices are sort of categorized in the same approval type pathway, and so I would look to the sort of the genomic LDT pathways that then how they get approval, and as to the same ways that you're likely going to need for a proteomic test. Again, because those are pretty complicated tests. So I think it's going to be the same pathway. One more pathway, I'd say health economics are a nice to have, but not a must have anymore. Okay. So I don't know, maybe they've been listening to my talks and I've persuaded them. Let's see. MDX did away with their coverage with evidence in development. Oh, MolDX did away with their coverage with evidence development. Oh, that's interesting because CMS still does that. But it's my understanding that Germany and France still offer this. Well, thank you for that information. I know CMS still does evidence with coverage development, but I can tell you in all the years that they've done evidence with coverage development, I can only think of 2 tests or 2 procedures, not even both, they weren't even both diagnostic tests, that they've ever actually approved at the end of those coverage with evidence development. What happens is they do these long coverage with evidence development studies, and at the end of them, either they just extend the coverage with evidence development, or they just say, no, it's not worth it. And so they haven't been terribly successful. They probably need to look at a different model for that to help get these tests out there sooner. How valuable is FDA approval? Okay, so that's a good question. So FDA approval to somebody like me in a lab, if the FDA approves your test, what I will do is it doesn't really affect me at all. The FDA, if it's not part of the FDA, that parallel pathway between the FDA and CMS, now that's a different story. But if you're just talking about FDA approval for a test, it doesn't mean anything. FDA only looks at clinical analytic validity and clinical validity. They do not look at clinical utility. Clinical utility is the purview of CMS. So CMS, so if you come to me with an FDA approved test, that's nice. And there are some benefits to that for you as a manufacturer. But at the end of the day, they've only looked at clinical validity. So unless you have clinical utility on top of that, that's not going to be helpful. CMS, MolDX, those folks do the clinical utility studies. That's the more important of the 2, at least for coverage from a commercial perspective. Let's see. MolDX offered coverage with data development. Oh yeah, coverage with data development, right. I remember that part of it. I think that is the last question that I've got. Matt, am I missing anything?
No, I think you did. That was addressed everything. Thank you very much, Lon. I think we're out of time. Is there anything else you'd like to add at this point?
No, I mean, I'm happy to stay and answer a couple more questions if anybody have them. Again, all I can tell you is I apologize. I know that we're not as accessible as benefit managers as we have been in the past. I feel bad, for you people. I'm sure you've heard from your colleagues who've been around a little bit longer how they used to go out and talk to this person and that person. They've had discussions with these people, and they did, and it was wonderful. And now we're just so inundated, just like everybody else, working really hard and so inundated that we just don't have the bandwidth to do that as often as we would like. I would love to hear about every test, but I just don't get a chance to do that. It would be really nice to, the only thing that we can do is at least where we think we might have some weaknesses or we have some questions, or if you have a new technology, I imagine we're going to talk a lot to the proteomic companies when they first come out, because we'll have some questions about how the test is run, what their process looks like and things like that. Now, after we get up to speed with that a little bit and talk to those companies, we won't talk to a lot of the follow-on companies with that because we'll have it down pat. Happened with liquid biopsy, right? The liquid biopsy people we had in a lot when it first came out because there was a lot to understand with that. It was pretty complicated, but we got that down and now we understand it. And so now we don't talk to the other ones as much just because we understand the technology. It's now really back to the evidence again. PLA versus MAAA versus CPT codes in regards to reimbursement. So I will tell you, there should be no difference in regards to reimbursement for those codes. Here's, if you want a trick or something to think about PLA codes. So anyways, almost all the plans that we work with can load any of those codes and pay off any of those codes. In the beginning, I will admit that that was difficult for some of our health plans. They just took them a while to get the PLA codes uploaded. Now, you will find that they're probably behind on the PLA codes a little bit. They may not get them uploaded, because, we're given like a 3-month lead time as to when those new codes are going to be launched. And we'll turn around, our information to the health plans on those codes within a week. It's a week of them coming out, so they have plenty of time. But it's a lot of an IT lift for them to do some of this stuff. And a lot of times they just don't have the bandwidth to do it immediately. So they're probably behind. But they will pay them just like they pay any other codes. Now, here's something for you to think about. If you're thinking about getting a PLA code, everybody wants a PLA code to, kind of identify their individual test. That's great if you are a test that's, got your evidence together. You're going to get clinical utility evidence and you're going to be paid for it because it identifies you and we pay you very quickly then. The other side of that is if you don't and you're an investigational and experimental test, a PLA code just gives us a way to identify you and not pay you immediately. So there's pluses and minuses to PLA codes depending upon how far along you are in your development. But they seem to be all the rage since every time I turn around, CMS is releasing a new swath of them. So, but again, there is some positives and some negatives about them. So just be aware when you start to apply for those types of codes.
Okay, I think did a great job, Lon. A lot of great comments. Thank you very much for taking the time today. We really appreciate it. Let's see, and we'll be providing everyone a recording of this webinar in a few days, and we'd also like to hear your feedback and suggestions for future topics with the goal to educate and discuss areas of interest for high-growth companies in life science and the molecular diagnostic market segments. Is there anything else you'd like to add, Lon, at this point?
No, thank you, Matt, for the opportunity. I really appreciate it, and it didn't hurt as much as I thought it would, so it's fine.
Good. Well, and also, just a real quick summary, and as I've mentioned, this is a complimentary leadership series sponsored by myself for leaders in the molecular diagnostic and life science tools domain. And if we can be a resource for you, please contact us. And thank you for attending, and we look forward to your participation in the future and really appreciate your contribution, Lon. It's been really very nice of you.
Thank you, everybody. I appreciate your attendance. Thank you, Matt, for inviting me.
All right. Thank you. Everyone have a nice day. Take care.